It's the Russian way of war. Death isn't an accident in this doctrine. It's expected, sometimes on a scale that would shatter almost any modern country. The theory is brutally simple. If you can take more pain than your enemy, eventually your enemy collapses. The battlefield becomes a grinder, and the side with the deepest reserves of people, money, and tolerance for loss wins by exhaustion. That time-tested attritional strategy is exactly what Vladimir Putin has leaned on ever since he invaded Ukraine. But here's the problem. It's not working. Putin's strategy to outlast Ukraine has started to blow up in his face. And what may be even worse for him, his last big hope, the idea that the West would eventually abandon Ukraine, is fading fast. This story has two sides. First, what Putin hoped would happen. Second, what is actually happening to Russia right now. And then there's a wild card, one unpredictable factor that could still reshape the entire conflict, not because it guarantees Putin victory, but because it can create chaos, confusion, and hesitation at the worst possible time. We'll get to that wild card in this video, but to understand why Putin's plan is cracking, we have to start with the plan itself. Quickly, before we dive in, chill guy here. If you want clear, story-driven breakdowns of what's really happening behind the headlines, hit subscribe, tap like, and comment where you're watching from. It helps the channel more than you think. Now let's talk about what Putin was counting on. Putin's bet. The West will quit first. In a January 16th interview on Times Radio's The Trump Report, Bill Browder, the founder of the Magnitsky Justice Campaign, spelled out Putin's mindset in plain language. Browder's point was chilling. Putin knows he's taking horrific casualties. We're talking about losses so high that in many countries, they would end the war politically overnight. Browder described it as roughly 1,000 Russian soldiers killed every day, an ongoing hemorrhage of manpower. And yet, Putin keeps pushing. Because in Browder's view, Putin isn't trying to win in the classic sense anymore, not purely by crushing Ukraine on the battlefield. Instead, Putin's victory condition has evolved into something far more political. Keep going long enough that the West gets tired and walks away. That's the we in Browder's quote. The collective West, democracies, free media, elections, public pressure, budget fights, political polarization, everything that makes open societies strong and also makes them vulnerable to fatigue. And Browder's warning is that Putin believes Western societies will twist themselves into knots over a small fraction of the discomfort Russia is enduring. He believes that even 1/100th of Russia's pain will feel unbearable in democracies. That's the central gamble, not resources versus resources, resources versus willpower. Putin is betting that Western willpower fails before Russian resources fail. And if he's right, even for a moment, Ukraine becomes vulnerable. Because in Putin's worldview, Ukraine's survival depends on the West continuing to deliver what Ukraine needs: air defenses, ammunition, money, intelligence support, and political backing. So Putin's plan is to push relentlessly, project power, and wait for political cracks. But here's where it gets more interesting. Putin isn't only relying on pressure, he's also trying to soothe European fears, because Europe is where he thinks willpower is easiest to break. We won't attack Europe if you respect us. In December 2025, Putin publicly dismissed the idea that Russia would attack other European countries as nonsense. He made these comments during a long televised address, hours of performance, meant to look steady, meant to look controlled. Putin's message was basically this: if you treat Russia with respect, if you respect our interests, there won't be any operations. That word respect is doing a lot of work, because what Putin really means is, let us do what we want in Ukraine, and you won't have any trouble. It's the mafia logic of geopolitics. Pay the tribute, look away, stay quiet, and you'll stay safe. But Putin either doesn't understand or refuses to accept that Russia's behavior in Ukraine is exactly why the West has been so firm. Ukraine isn't a distant, irrelevant theater anymore. It's become a test of whether borders mean anything in Europe. So those soothing words are not peace, they're persuasion. They're targeted at audiences in Europe who might be tempted to say, this has gone on too long. It's draining our resources. And to be fair, Putin has reasons to believe fatigue can happen, because many people think the West's initial response to the invasion was too slow, too cautious, and too worried about escalation. That criticism has been building for years. The hesitation problem, and why Putin thought it would continue. A Ukrainian commentator, Bohdan Nihaylo, wrote a piece in the Kyiv Post on January 17th, arguing that delays in appeasement helped Russia build momentum, especially with winter airstrikes that left thousands of Ukrainians without electricity and heating. Nihaylo focused on one recurring issue: air defenses. Ukraine has pleaded for air defense systems repeatedly over the years, and often those requests were met with hesitation, delays, and political worries about provoking Moscow. Western leaders, especially in Washington, feared escalation. They worried about looking too involved. They did send weapons, javelins, HIMARS, systems that helped Ukraine fight back, but those weapons don't stop missiles launched from far away. They don't stop drones coming in waves. So from Putin's perspective, the pattern looked like this. The West is nervous. The West is cautious. The West fears escalation. So if I keep pushing, they'll eventually retreat. That's why Putin's mantra becomes just keep it up. He's counting on the West staying scared. He's counting on a slow drip of political doubt turning into a flood. And all of the threats, cajoling, and respect talk have an ulterior motive. You can see it clearly in Putin's approach to peace talks. Peace talks as a weapon, not a solution. In November, the Atlantic Council made an observation that cuts through the fog. Putin talks about peace, while escalating efforts to erase Ukraine. In occupied regions, the story isn't reconciliation, it's coercion. Ukrainian symbols of statehood, heritage, and culture are targeted, replaced, scrubbed away. The campaign is effectively a Russification drive, trying to convert occupied territory into a different identity entirely. That's not peace. That's conquest with paperwork. And Putin's deeper desire isn't a quiet end to the war. He wants Europe to revert to something older, something more obedient, something closer to the geopolitical environment he understood when he was shaped inside the KGB. That's why claims that he will stop at Ukraine must be treated with extreme skepticism. Because the strategy is the same as it's always been. Outlast the enemy. Only now the twist is that Putin increasingly treats the West, especially Europe, as the enemy he must outlast, not just Ukraine. His dream scenario is simple. The West throws in the towel, Ukraine is isolated, and Russia dictates the terms. But here's the problem for Putin. What we're seeing in the West right now is not surrender, it's reinforcement. January 2026, signs of a West that is not backing down. Look at January 2026 alone. On January 16th, Ukraine and the United Kingdom marked the first anniversary of their historic 100-year partnership. That's not just symbolism. That's a message. A message that the UK intends to support Ukraine's sovereignty long after the current phase of war ends and long after Putin himself is gone. On the same date, the UK pledged $20 million, about $27 million to support Ukraine's energy security. Not just weapons, not just speeches, practical support, infrastructure support, long-term commitment. And just about 10 days before that anniversary, the Paris Declaration was revealed, an agreement involving Ukraine, the US, and a group known as the Coalition of the Willing, spearheaded by the UK and France. The purpose? Security guarantees for Ukraine after the war ends. This isn't about hoping Ukraine survives. It's about planning as if Ukraine will survive and preparing for the next phase so Russia can't simply regroup and strike again. The declaration includes serious ideas, a multinational force, a proposed US-led ceasefire verification mechanism, and binding commitments about how the coalition would respond if Russia tries another invasion in the future. In other words, the West is actively working toward a future where Ukraine exists, which is the opposite of what Putin's strategy is supposed to achieve. And then we get to the tangible moves, actions that physically hit Russian interests. Shadow fleet pressure, paper commitments turn into real consequences. January also saw Ukraine's allies seize 3 Shadow Fleet vessels, ships used to move oil under constraints, sanctions, and political pressure. The first 2 seizures reportedly occurred during the first week of the year, when U.S. forces boarded and detained the Marinera and the MT Sofia. Those ships had links to Venezuela, a country that overlaps with Russian Shadow Fleet networks in the way these oil movements happen. Then more recently, France, with help from the UK, seized another vessel in the Mediterranean. The ship was called the Grinch, almost too perfect a name for a vessel tied to a system that survives by dodging transparency. It was boarded, examined, and taken for further inspection. And that matters for one reason. Declarations and partnerships are paper-proof that support exists. Seizing oil tankers is a physical reminder that support exists right now. It tells Moscow, we're not just talking, we're acting. Ukraine hopes these seizures continue and perhaps escalate. But Browder raises an important point. The intensity of this pressure may depend on what the Trump administration signals to European leaders like Emmanuel Macron and Keir Starmer, because U.S. actions may be conditional, based on what benefits U.S. policy at a given moment, and Putin is watching all of it. Remember his framework, attrition, resources versus willpower. So when he sees multiple signs of Western reinforcement in just a few weeks, he sees his strategy failing. But what may hurt him even more is something his strategy doesn't fully account for, the war's blowback inside Russia. What Putin didn't plan for, Russia's internal decay. A strategy that focuses on Russian resource strength, men, weapons, money, can miss a key reality. Those resources are not abstract. They are people. They are families. They are regions being drained. And the longer this war continues, the more Russia's internal damage becomes pronounced. Let's start with one of the most important battlegrounds in this entire conflict, the Shadow Fleet. Browder points out that there's one person dealing with the Shadow Fleet in a very direct way, Volodymyr Zelensky. Not with speeches, with strikes. Ukraine has been systematically immobilizing Shadow Fleet vessels as they move, sometimes inside the Black Sea, sometimes beyond it. Toward the end of November, Ukrainian strike drones targeted Russian oil tankers attempting to transit the Black Sea. Months earlier, the Kyiv Post reported Ukraine had conducted a series of surgical strikes against Black Sea vessels, sometimes in international waters, sometimes in ports. And the significance is straightforward. A Shadow Fleet ship that can't sail is a ship Russia can't use to sell its oil. That's attrition in action. But Ukraine went even further. The oil campaign hit the transport, hit the product, hit the system. Ukraine has attacked the Shadow Fleet indirectly by going after oil infrastructure. In 2025, Ukraine accelerated long-range strikes against Russian refineries and related infrastructure. The reported effects were dramatic. BISI, the Bloomsbury Intelligence and Security Institute, noted that about 55% of Russia's refineries had been targeted since Ukraine's first refinery strike in June 2022. But 2025 was described as the banner year. Ukraine reportedly shut down around 20% of Russia's refining capacity, and it carried out significantly more successful strikes in 2025 than in 2024. And the logic is brutal. Russia's budget relies heavily on oil and gas sales, about 30%, according to the same institute. So if you disrupt the Shadow Fleet and you disrupt refining and you disrupt storage and you disrupt drilling rigs, you are attacking the bloodstream of the Russian war machine. An extra layer, Ukraine has also hit crude oil storage facilities, and in January, strikes in the Caspian Sea reportedly targeted oil drilling rigs. Then we get to the outcome. A January 20th report from oilprice.com said Russia's crude supply to refineries was at its lowest in 15 years. Crude processing rates also declined compared to the previous year, an expected outcome when there is simply less crude available. Russia's explanation? Unscheduled maintenance. That's the polite phrase for, our facilities are being damaged, and we can't say it plainly. Now, how does this connect back to Putin's strategy? It's about willpower. Putin wants the West to believe Ukraine's fight is hopeless, but Ukraine's strikes tell a different story. Ukraine has the will to fight. Ukraine has the ability to impose cost. And with continued support, Ukraine can outlast Russia. And this is where Putin's resource logic collapses, because he is losing the very resources he needs to keep grinding. Oil revenue pressure is one, manpower is another. Manpower, the resource that doesn't come back. Browder points to Ukrainian statistics, suggesting around 1.2 million young men have been killed or permanently disabled. He describes it as unimaginable. And Ukrainian sources have suggested it has risen beyond 1.23 million since the interview. Whether every number is exact or disputed, the core reality is undeniable. Russia has suffered mass casualty and disability on a scale that reshapes a society. This isn't just a military problem. It becomes a demographic problem, an economic problem, a social stability problem. And privately, Browder suggests many Russians must be thinking this has to stop, if only to ensure there are Russians left after the end of the war. But there's another consequence. Even those who survive don't always return home in the way people imagine. The brutality, boomerang, returning soldiers, and rising violence. Russia cycles soldiers in and out of Ukraine. Some are contract soldiers who can return home if they survive their stints, but war changes people, and when men are exposed to extreme brutality, often not just against the enemy, but within their own ranks, they don't always return as they left. Browder argues that violent crime rising in Russia should be expected. These returning soldiers have been trained, sometimes poorly, sometimes brutally, to kill and maim. They've seen friends destroyed. They've endured trauma, fear, rage, and humiliation, and when psychologically damaged veterans return, some bring that violence back with them. A December 2025 report from the Moscow Times said returning Russian soldiers were linked to over 1,000 killings and injuries during the years of the war. And the number is especially alarming because relatively few soldiers have returned so far compared to the total forces involved. If the war ended tomorrow, roughly 695,000 soldiers could return, by some estimates. Only a percentage would bring violence home. But even a small percentage is enough to destabilize communities. Ironically, that would mean even more manpower, Putin's resource, lost to death and injury inside Russia itself. And despite everything Putin has spent and lost, Ukraine still stands, and so does the support of its allies, which brings us back to the wild card. The wild card, the United States, and the Trump factor. The wild card is the United States, more specifically, the Trump administration. Browder highlights how contradictory U.S. posture can look under Trump. On one hand, the Venezuelan operation capturing Nicolas Maduro was framed as a spectacular display of capability. The idea, American forces could immobilize defenses, execute the mission, and leave without losing a single American life. That's the type of power Putin wants, and 4 years of grinding warfare has proven Putin doesn't have it. So you'd think the message to Moscow is clear. You cannot outmuscle the West. But on the other hand, Browder points to something else. Trump's claims that the U.S. should be granted control over Greenland. Browder argues that this creates rhetorical ammunition for Putin, because Putin can twist it into, if America can take what it wants, why can't Russia take Crimea or Ukraine? Trump may not intend to give Putin that talking point, but geopolitics isn't only about intention. It's about narratives. It's about what can be exploited. And then there's the mixed signaling toward Ukraine. Even when actions support Ukraine, like tanker seizures, Trump has also said things that keep Ukraine guessing. In mid-January, Trump publicly blamed Zelensky for why a peace deal hadn't been reached. The Kremlin reacted quickly. Dmitry Peskov echoed the framing and said essentially, "We agree." And because Peskov often reflects Putin's line, that reaction tells you something important. Putin may still believe he has an opening. He may still believe his willpower versus resources strategy could work if the wild card breaks the wrong way. But here's the problem with wild cards. You never know what they'll do next. And as long as the rest of the West, especially Europe, stands firm, the wild card's power is limited. That's why Putin's plan is collapsing. Because even if the U.S. becomes unpredictable, the broader Western structure is moving toward long-term support mechanisms that don't vanish overnight, and that pushes Putin toward an uncomfortable reality. He's already in the endgame, even if he doesn't realize it. Putin's endgame: escalation without a path to victory. Putin's geopolitical influence is weakening. Economic pressures are mounting. Oil revenues are under stress. Manpower is draining. Internal social stability is being threatened by war blowback. And when you pile all of that together, Putin enters a no-win zone, where the only thing left is escalation. Not escalation that guarantees victory. Escalation because there are fewer and fewer exits. That is the trap Putin built for himself. And if Ukraine's allies remain firm, if security guarantees hold, if pressure continues, if Russia's resource base keeps eroding, then Putin's final play for victory doesn't just fall short. It collapses. Because attrition only works when you can outlast the other side. And the longer this goes on, the more it starts to look like Russia is the one being bled, financially, demographically, and socially, toward the edge. Now, if you want the next layer of this story, including what escalation might look like and why the endgame can be the most dangerous phase of all, check out the next video. And chill guy again, if you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe, like, and comment your take. Does Putin still believe the West will quit first? Or is he realizing too late that his strategy has failed? This is The Military Show, and I'll see you in the next one.